This is the Human Action Podcast with your hosts, Jeff Deist and Dr. Bob Murphy.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back once again to the Human Action Podcast, joined as always by my co-host, Dr. Bob Murphy. How you doing, Bob?
I'm doing all right, Jeff. So far, no raids on my property.
No raids on your house this week?
Yeah.
Well, that brings us to our topic, which is namely two news stories. One surrounding the IRS, which under the new Inflation Reduction Act is set to receive a bunch of funding and apparently going to hire about 87,000 new IRS agents, some of whom will presumably be armed, according to the job description. And also in tandem with this, the FBI's raid on Donald Trump's Mar-a-Lago home this week, ostensibly looking for documents. We're not exactly sure what kind of documents or to what criminal matter they might refer, because we have not yet seen, as of today, either the warrant nor any of the particular documents they were seeking under that warrant. But nonetheless, Bob, this has resulted in a frenzy of news stories, and I'm afraid that a lot of even our listeners might view this as an example of administrative agencies run amok, that this is somehow outside of the norm when they get into areas of mission creep, or when they get into even outright criminality, ignoring the rule of law, the so-called separation of powers, and go rogue. When in fact, in our tradition of economics and others, there's a whole history of people studying this very phenomenon. People like the late James Burnham, who wrote The Managerial Revolution. Obviously, the public choice people have a lot to say about what bureaucrats do in their own interests when placed into power. Ludwig von Mises, of course, wrote the great book Bureaucracy in the 1940s about what he called the supremacy of officialdom, talking about Germany in particular. And so I don't like this idea that we're looking at this as an aberration. I think these two news stories this week point out what we're really living under, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Jeff. And I mean, you look at any metric you want in terms of measuring the size of government, whether it's expenditures, taxation, and not just in dollar terms, but even like as a percent of GDP. How many employees does the government have? Look at the separation, the distinction between what the federal government does and what the state governments do. Like, I think a lot of modern Americans think the word federal means like the one in charge or the supreme or what, but a federal system was supposed to mean the states are supposed to do some things and as opposed to like a central government, and leading to the joke that the Federal Reserve is neither federal nor has a reserve. And then, one of the, I think, key figures here too, besides the ones you mentioned, is Bob Higgs and his so-called ratchet effect, where he says, in Crisis and Leviathan, his great work, just studying it, that, this always happens when there's a crisis, and this is both parties, of course, this isn't a partisan thing, that they use that opportunity to expand their power. And then once the immediate crisis passes, they do pull back a little bit, but they never go to the pre-crisis baseline. And so that's how over time, and so, the chart of it looks like a ratchet. That's why over time the government tends to expand. And another thing to just look at a history book. Who are the greatest presidents? It's not the ones who avoided a war. It's not the ones who had policies in places there wasn't a depression or things like that. Mm-hmm. It's the ones who expanded the scope of government. That always goes hand in hand with a so-called great president. Or you could see how many people died on their watch. That's also another way to gauge who the historians are going to say is a great president.
When we talk about Higgs and the ratchet effect, what's the crisis here? Donald Trump? That Donald Trump exists and was elected president, that's the crisis?
Right. I mean, I guess they would say, January 6th. I mean, you've seen the over-the-top rhetoric about how, Trump is the worst threat the Republic has ever faced. More than Osama bin Laden, more than Adolf Hitler, more than Stalin, it's Donald Trump. So, yes, I guess in their mindset, they would say that, and that is, even though we would say that's truly a manufactured crisis. I guess that's what they would say. And hey, he's got these documents we don't even know. Something just before I forget to mention it, it was really Orwellian to me that I was watching, of course, the pundits react to that right after Trump is saying, "Hey, this just happened," and one analyst said something like, well, normally in a case like this, the FBI wouldn't say anything after they raided somebody's house, but because of the special circumstances of this case, they may be forced to make a statement. And that really blew me away that, the FBI could just come in somebody's house and take their stuff and they don't even need to. I understand you wouldn't say it ahead of time if it's supposed to be a surprise and, you want to catch the mobster with his pants down sort of thing. But it really just struck me that that's this, the baseline that he thought it was no big deal that the FBI would go into someone's private house, take stuff, and that, in this case, they may even tell the public what it's for.
Well, as far as Trump being the greatest threat to our republic, I wonder if people remember in the War of 1812, the British burned down the White House. I mean, presumably that would not fly today. I don't think the Brits have that in the works anytime soon with their next PM. But nonetheless, it's interesting how things are so politicized now, and maybe this is a healthy thing from our perspective, that there's immediately both sides-ism. And immediately it's as though Americans are watching two different movies. And so David French, of all people, over at the Flaccid National Review, he immediately issued a couple tweets. Given that we haven't seen the warrant, much less the warrant application, the immediate frenzied anger at the FBI is completely unjustified. There's no reason to believe a former president is above the law. Well, what is this, kindergarten conjunction junction after school special? Every president's been above the law basically since the beginning of American history, for one. And then he goes on, if the DOJ's actions turn out to be unjustified, then responsible agents should be held accountable. Yes, and we should all get a new bike for Christmas. It's this kind of credulity on behalf of, I guess we'll call him a pretty good embodiment of conservative ink. It's so absurd. And I actually think as much as I hate the politicization of everything, something like this, which is inherently political, a sitting president basically sicking his Justice Department on not only the former president, but the one most likely to run against him again. I mean, you can't escape politics in this context. I think it's healthy that the American people immediately look at this and give zero credence to the idea that Merrick Garland is simply a nonpartisan, rule of law guy following the evidence wherever it takes him, and he doesn't care about the timing of this or the media or the appearance or anything else. Nobody's buying that. Even if it's maybe true, infinitesimally possible that is what's happening, nobody's buying that. And maybe that's a measure of success for people who view politics the way we do, that even the normies in American society have become so jaded about it.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that is a sign of progress because it's closer to the truth. Like you say, is it literally impossible that he's just following the law? I suppose not, but in practice, no, I don't believe that for a second. Of course, this is political. Of course, the timing of this raid. Now, I don't know, and maybe you want to speculate about this too, is part of what we talk about today, Jeff, but I don't know exactly what the calculations are in terms of, how does this affect what the voters do going into this election? Is the plan really so that Trump is in prison so he can't run for office, or is this just supposed to cast doubt? Who knows? Is this supposed to motivate people so they get out and vote? I don't know exactly what the calculation is in terms of the politics and the fallout, but certainly, yeah, the idea that this had nothing to do with that and they had no idea. I mean, that's just. I mean, did you see the clip, Jeff, with the press secretary when she was acting like? What in this so-called the raid or whatever you want to know, the White House had no knowledge of this beforehand.
Was the president or anyone at the White House aware of that search warrant, or has anyone at the White House or the president been briefed in the aftermath of that search warrant being executed?
No, the president was not briefed, was not aware of it. No one at the White House was given a heads up. No, that did not happen.
She was acting like even after it happened, they didn't even know what you guys are talking about. I mean, it just. They're not even good liars.
Well, it's possible that intentionally the White House was not briefed. In other words, there was some back channel communication. They said, make sure it looks like we didn't have anything to do with this. That's entirely possible. As to the end game here, it's complex. I wrote an article today about this. Sure, clearly there's been a war against Trump and Trumpism since the day he won the election over Hillary Clinton. And that initially took the form of Russiagate, and it's taken the forms of all kinds of things, impeachment since then. So clearly there is a war afoot against Trumpism. And so this could be viewed as a warning against Trump and his associates by the Garland people, by the Justice Department, by the FBI, to say, look, don't get ahead of yourself with these electoral dreams of 2024, because we could still bring you down. We could still imprison you. We could still take all of your family's wealth, destroy the Trump empire. I mean, these are certainly possibilities. We will link to a great article by Jonathan Turley, who's a law prof up at George Washington, who blogs very frequently on all of this kind of thing. And he laid out the case. There's a case under the 14th Amendment where if Trump was deemed to have participated in an insurrection on January 16th, he would be disqualified under, I guess it's the third clause, Article 3 of the 14th Amendment. I might be wrong. It might be Article 4 of it, where he would be disqualified from holding office. There's also a federal statute dealing with removal of classified items, which Turley cites, which maybe creates a more dubious rationale for preventing Trump even from running. So, that's sort of the obvious idea behind what's going on here, the politicization of the Justice Department and the FBI in service of the current administration, which is nothing at all new, nothing at all. I mean, go back and read the history of J. Edgar Hoover, for example. Mm-hmm. What's sometimes not always the case is that the FBI and the Justice Department are working on behest of the current president, but rather against the current president. They have certainly been known to do that. So, yes, there's a case that this is all a political warning shot across the bow to try to dissuade Trump from running, or to even prevent him from running by throwing him in jail or having him deemed unfit under the 14th Amendment. I think that might be a bit much. I think this is more a general softening up. I mean, the idea here is to not only harm Trump's political chances, but also those of the MAGA movement he created, or at least was a symbol of, the populist movement. They want to say that not only are certain candidates, but certain ideas are beyond the pale. They're outside of the bounds of the 3x5 card of acceptable opinion. We need to basically criminalize those. If you're an election denier, for example, that note the coded language to imply you're like a Holocaust denier. An election denier is someone who questions the results in Georgia or some other state. An insurrectionist is someone who went to the Capitol on January 6th to protest the election, whereas an Antifa rioter who burned down a police station in Wisconsin, or who basically shut down a federal courthouse in Seattle, Washington for months on end is not an insurrectionist. A person who questions this Trump-Russian collusion BS around the 2016 election is a Putin fanatic. I mean, so all of this is designed to move us towards criminalizing certain thoughts and also putting people outside the bounds of acceptable society. And so if you push this hard enough, the idea or the goal is to say, look, when it comes to presidential elections, you can vote for a Mitt Romney, you can vote for a Hillary Clinton, you can maybe vote for a Ted Cruz or a Scott Walker on the margins, but that's about it. That's who you're allowed to vote for, and not another Donald Trump. And so I think that's motivating a lot of this. And that's what's so scary, of course, about these administrative agencies and the managerial revolution of the 20th century. And I want to get into that a little bit, what James Burnham had to say about that and what Mises had to say about it, because I think they'd be surprised by the degree to which this has overtaken us.
Well, yeah, you raise a lot of interesting points there. I do want to just stress, I know most of the listeners know this, but it is possible to think that Trump did things that were illegal or unethical, let's say, and that the FBI is acting politically, and this isn't about, the institution of justice. And that's sort of the thing that amazes me when you watch these debates on social media, is that when someone's complaining about the FBI doing this, the other side naturally, oh, so you think Trump is just a goody two shoes and Boy Scout? And no. But clearly, you could have one without the other. And also, what's just shocking to me about all this, not shocking, but it's insane, is how so many progressive leftists all of a sudden don't think the FBI would ever harass someone unless they're a bad guy, when, they famously were investigating and, had Martin Luther King in their crosshairs, Look what happened to Richard Jewell. Certainly the FBI, they weren't the bastions of justice at that point. And also, I would say, even with respect to Trump, if people don't know about this, go look at the Inspector General's report on what the FBI was doing when they had their FISA applications to look at the members of the Trump election team. So the report came out, I think, in December 2019. And just go look at that. So again, this isn't like you're having to rely on something coming from some right-wing news outlet. Just go read the Inspector General's own report. So the media coverage of it was very misleading. But if you actually just read the report, it's jaw-dropping. The way that the FBI, when they were applying for the continued legal ability to wiretap or other electronic means of spying on the Trump team, they clearly were withholding key information from, the judge and everything in those applications. And the IG report kind of says they did that and then just moves on. So it's how this stuff happens when there's audits in Washington, is if you want to go see it, they tell you what they did, but then they just act like it was no big deal and they move on with their lives. So all that is there for anyone who wants to see it. So Trump defenders who are saying the FBI is out to get them, they have a pretty strong leg to stand on. They're not just grasping at straws. And like you said too, Jeff, the double standards is hilarious. That, remember, it was going into the original election between Trump and Hillary Clinton, Democrats were afraid that Trump was going to say the election was stolen. And so they were really, making sure, let's get on record. This is going to be the cleanest election in history. Come on, don't listen to this double talk. And also the phrase fake news was originally used by the left to denounce memes and stuff going around Facebook, making fun of Hillary Clinton or saying she did something with her emails. That's where the term fake news came from, and Trump just grabbed it ironically and turned it on CNN. That he didn't coin that phrase. So it is funny how now things have gotten switched. And like you say, Jeff, the very idea of questioning whether someone won an election is now, it's not just wrong, but it's like a sign that you should be excluded from the conversation. It's really amazing.
Well, it's also a matter of selective enforcement. Federal law is so complex, so Byzantine, you could presumably go after any president. Trump certainly is not the first president, or people around him are not the first people around a president to depart office and take some documents with them.
Right.
So the statute, which Jonathan Turley discusses in the article we'll link, could presumably be applied to any former president just about, and a lot of former cabinet members over the years. A lot of CIA people we know have taken documents out of secure storage. So that's a mess. I want to talk a little bit about James Burnham. A lot of you know him as the author of The Machiavellians, and he was a National Review stalwart in the mid-century and wrote a lot about managerialism and administrative state. So if you read Burnham, you'll realize that he takes a very sort of cold-blooded look at the reality of administrative bureaucracies rather than an ideological or romantic look at them. And basically, what he comes up with is a bit of a challenge, I think, to libertarians, because we tend to still cling to the idea that there's a basic choice, the economic means or the political means. Those are the two ways to organize society. That roughly comes down as socialism versus capitalism, and there is no third way. Neoliberalism or a mixed economy or all these other things don't really represent a third way. But I think Burnham points out that managerialism, and he's writing this in the 1940s, early 1941 actually is when he comes out with the Managerial Revolution. That almost does start to look like a third way. And let me just quote a little bit from his book. Again, this is 1941. It's pretty prescient thinking about it. So what he's talking about is the result is a fused political economic apparatus. And quoting Burnham, he says, fusion of the economy with the state, expansion of the state functions to comprise also control of the economy, offers, whether or not the managers individually recognize it, the only available means, on the one hand, for making the economic structure workable again after its capitalist breakdown. So again, Burnham was no right-wing ideologue loving capitalism. On the other, for putting managers in the position of the ruling class. The managers will shift the locus of sovereignty, nice phrase, from parliamentary assemblies representing the capitalist class to the administrative bureaus of the expanded state. The executive branch and its bureaucracy will undermine the older assemblies and intermediary institutions in the Congress, the state legislatures, local governments, and independent organizations. So he's basically predicting in 1941, which is already in motion, especially with the New Deal a decade earlier, but is that basically the legislative branch yields to the executive. And boy, oh boy, that's how you get things like 87,000 new IRS agents without much of a peep from Congress.
Right. And also, too, I think he did anticipate, I think even the quote there, you just had some hints of this, that, the people running these large bureaucratic, nominally private sector organizations, they would sort of ally with some of the people, in the executive branch, and would be this new form of social control, whatever you want to call it. And that's certainly the model going forward. I mean, that's partly, we've talked about this in earlier episodes, Jeff, with this, the kind of system that they're inaugurating in China and that is being copied around the West, where big companies kind of know what in the U.S., like what Washington wants, and then they can set their own policies. And so technically, it's just a policy of a Fortune 500 company. Hey, that's private property. They can do whatever they want, like whether it's a vaccine passport or what have you. You're not making investments the right way that, according to certain criteria, well, then you can get dinged. In China, if you criticize the party, you might not just go to jail, but now you can't get a hotel room. And why does the hotel room do that? Because then, there's a hierarchy of your social credit score. And so, yes, at some point in that chain, there is the coercion of the Chinese Communist Party using government guns, but a lot of it is just everybody in that system kind of just keeping their head down. And so it is a way that, sort of blending state and private, in a way that clearly is not free in some abstract sense of that term, but it's tricky for like a dogmatic libertarian to get in the, because again, everyone says, well, it's a private company, they can do what they want, but in the context of the overall scheme. So if that's the kind of stuff he's getting at there, I think he's right. And I do have now more sympathy, Jeff, with people who say, yeah, you libertarians can talk about your laissez-faire society, but it's not stable. We don't have it. And, maybe that's unfair. And you can say, well, we got to educate the public or whatever, but I can see how they would recoil against that, because that's what a Marxist would say. Like, oh yeah, we tried in the Soviet Union, it didn't work, but because we just didn't get it right. It's not a knock against the theory. So both sides are going to say that. I happen to think our theory is right, but.
Well, there's also Burnham's idea that the managerial class shares all kinds of commonalities that they don't share with average people. And those commonalities cross over from government managers to private sector managers, so ostensibly, but also across national borders. In other words, the managerial elite in France have far more to do with the managerial elite in America than they do with their own French ostensible constituency. So I think that's an interesting point. Mises, of course, wrote this little slim book, Bureaucracy, in 1944. We did a show on it a few years back, and I recall Bill Anderson, who's one of our editors at Mises.org, he made the interesting point that in 1944, paper was rationed. So slim little books were were what you did back then. So this is a great little read, just a little over 100 pages. We'll link to it if people want to. But it's really, Mises really talks about how the supremacy of officialdom is how he described bureaucracy in Germany, how it would come to the fore. And he's writing this, a couple decades after socialism and after liberalism and nation state and economy. So now we're getting into World War II, and he's realizing what's happening. And so he's got some great quotes here. Here's one. On the other hand, we must realize that delegation of power is the main instrument of modern dictatorship. So that's a pretty heavy-duty sentence right there. And he gets into a lot of conditions of what bureaucracy brings us. And he basically says that, the administrative society becomes part and parcel of any totalitarian scheme, because you don't just have jackbooted thugs kicking in doors in the middle of the night. You have bureaucrats sort of grinding people with paperwork. So they're both elements of overreach or a totalitarian society. And, I wonder what that means in context with this IRS thing. Most people, Bob, think of IRS agents as, accountants or tax-enrolled agents who are going to bother you and have little petty power trips and might force you to track down a piece of paper and then end up giving you a big fine. But they don't so much think of them as armed agents like FBI agents. But now we're finding out that that's, they're getting closer.
Yeah, well, I know, so I'll withhold his name for privacy reasons, but I'm good friends with a businessman who said, this was years ago in the 80s, and he was way behind. It was after there was a big crash, and he was way behind on what he owed the IRS. And he said someone from the IRS came in to meet with him to discuss, your case, sir. And the guy was very courteous and everything, but he said in the beginning of the meeting, the guy pulled a sidearm off and put it on the table just to make sure everyone knew there's a gun in the room. Then that's, so that is an intimidation tactic that apparently has been used. Another thing too, it's a minor point, but I think people are a lot of people analyzing this. They're not seeing like the cause and effect or like the looking ahead that they say, the agents, the people enforcing the law, they don't set the policy. It's, the Congress does that, whatever. But Congress knows what they can get away with. And so, in terms of if they, like you and I know, Jeff, just how bad the fiscal position of the U.S. federal government is, especially going forward, especially if there's another crash. So, knowing if we have to tighten up the screws and jack up the top tax rate and so on, and, get rid of some of these deductions or clamp down on these things, we need to first get in a whole influx of bodies, give them a few years, to learn the ropes and figure out what they're doing. And then we can really be in a position to jack up those rates. Whereas, with the existing enforcement infrastructure, they know, well, if we did that, most of the people would just slip away. So the two go hand in hand. It's, like just as an analogy, when people say like, hey, should prisoners be allowed to like what if someone gives up a kidney, can they get a reduction in their sentencing? If it's voluntary, right? And as and among other possible things of answering that, I would say, no, that's horrifying because the judges would know that when they were giving the sentences out in the first place, right? Like, in other words, you can't just assume that the one is fixed and then this is just something that's added onto it. So yeah, the existing tax code that we have is going to be more draconian given that now they have 87,000 new agents coming on to enforce it.
Well, and let's not kid ourselves, folks. If you're in the top 5 or 10% of wealthiest Americans, you're never going to meet with an IRS agent. That agent is going to meet with your team of lawyers from Skadden Arps or some firm like that, and they're going to have nice suits on, and they're going to run circles around this poor guy. I mean, unless there was some case of intentional fraud or something like that where the IRS might be able to haul the actual taxpayer into a deposition or something, but very unlikely. So, it's going to be people of average means who have to deal with the IRS personally. So that's first and foremost. Second of all, the field of federal law is so vast that almost all bills passed by Congress have enabling legislation contained in them, which basically says that the particular department or agency charged with enacting with carrying out the particular laws can issue such Treasury directives, Treasury regulations as required to carry it out. So the vast bulk of actual dictates under which you and I are supposed to live on the federal level are actually written by the administrative agency personnel themselves to carry out legislation, broad, sweeping legislation passed by Congress. So the nuts and bolts, the details are very much up to the administrative agencies. And when you start talking about arming these guys or gals, I mean, this is just, if you talk to police officers, they will tell you on most police forces only have to qualify on their handguns once a year. And so, contrary to popular image, most cops are very bad shots. They're just not very proficient with their weapons. They rarely, if ever, use them, and they only really have to train or qualify on them once a year. That's a broad statement, but in bulk. So imagine how much worse it would be when you're not even talking about a police officer whose gun may be something that they could conceivably need in danger. I mean, giving the IRS officer a gun is just purely an intimidation. It's like Barney Fife or something. So this is pretty unholy, and you wonder what will become of this. I mean, everything we put in place today can become wildly evil in the future. If you go back and read Harry Truman's biography, he didn't write a normal biography. He sat down with a journalist and allowed that journalist to interview him, a friendly journalist, and put that out in biography form, autobiography form almost. And it's interesting because Truman says, well, at the time, they sold me on the creation of the CIA as a way to streamline government. Presidents were getting too many intelligence reports, one from the Army, one from the Navy, one from the OSS, one from the FBI. I'm getting too many of these intelligence reports, and we need an agency whose job is to sit down and comb through all this information and present one report to the president every month or whatever it might be, and this will actually streamline the process. And so he said, well, I kind of bought that, hook, line, and sinker. He said, little did I realize it would quickly become an entity unto itself. And as we all know, the CIA has turned on members of Congress and threatened them. It's turned on members of the U.S. Supreme Court. It's probably turned on presidents. I'll just say probably and qualify that a bit. And so kudos to Harry Truman for having the honesty, not all that much later in life before he died, to say, yeah, I made a mistake in creating the CIA. And imagine what this could create. Imagine what the IRS could become if America keeps getting more and more politicized.
Yeah, I think you mentioned the public choice school of thought, and that what do they do in that arena of economics? They just look at incentives and what do the people want, to just like standard economics looks at firms and assumes they're trying to maximize shareholder value or profit, and they look at consumers or they're trying to maximize utility, blah, blah, blah. And what do government officials do? And if you're the head of an agency, as a first approximation, let's just model it that you're trying to expand the scope or the budget or the number of employees that your agency has, and that's a pretty good first approximation. So yeah, in practice, there's other things going on. Just like in practice, firms care about the people running them care about things besides profit. But you can understand why that's a first approximation, just to see how it works. And the other thing too is it's not so much that the people are inherently of that mindset, but that the kind of person that gets promoted up in the ranks, right? So there's a selection process. So it's not that literally everyone who goes to Washington is a monster, but if you're going to ascend the ranks and be a senator 30 years later, probably you're not a Boy Scout. Like the way the system is, you would not have been able to navigate and go through all that stuff. So that's, there's that element involved too. So yes, who is more likely to become the head of the FBI? It's not someone who wants to shrink it, just as a general rule of any organization, and it happens to be true. So in other words, you can see how, someone who becomes the head of a research division in a private company, they're probably not going to shut it down. No, how do you build your legacy is you expand it. And so why would you assume that would all of a sudden be different when it comes to the coercive state?
Well, can you elaborate a little bit more on how public choice views the choices facing a bureaucrat and how they act in self-interested ways, just as we imagine that private sector actors do?
Sure. So like it depends what they're modeling. So if they're modeling like a politician, then they assume that they want to get reelected. And so then you can, push that back a step. Okay, they want to get, they want to appeal to the median voter. And there's all sorts of theorems and things like that in terms of the models of public choice. But yeah, if they're looking at someone who's not directly elected, but is the head of an organization, then, they just take it as a first approximation. What are we assuming that they're trying to do? And they'd say, they're trying to maximize their budget, or they're trying to maximize like the number of employees that, their organization holds. And then empirically, if you look at that, that certainly seems to be the case. And again, you can push it back one step and say, well, why would that be? And it's partly because, if you were the kind of person that thought the FBI was a stain on American society, you probably don't want a career at the FBI. So you would never have the experience to get appointed to be, the head of the FBI. Or if you were someone who hated the FBI, you're not going to be put in charge of it, right? And so that's sort of the logic of seeing that. And then, somebody who is successful, someone who has the ability and the interest in getting a bigger budget for the FBI, let's say, like they know how to schmooze the right people in Congress, they know how to lean on certain people. Maybe they go and get Hoover's supposedly, having used that ability to get really incriminating tapes on certain key congressmen and just let them know, boy, it'd be a shame if this were to hit the New York Times, wouldn't it? That, that's how you stay in power, right? So somebody who's willing to do that and play dirty is likely to, be reappointed and stay there and over time grow the agency. The more budget you have, the more ability you have to do things like that. right? So it all kind of goes hand in hand, or like with the CIA even more so because they have more of a scope to do things clandestinely. So, once the CIA is sort of given this carte blanche that, oh yeah, you guys can do stuff, just kind of, don't get caught. And we know you're funding things that aren't even on the books. And you got guys that are, maybe violating the 10 Commandments in different countries and whatever. Just don't get caught. Don't embarrass us. That kind of rogue agency is going to do all sorts of stuff, once you let them go off on their own like that. So it's, again, I guess the thing with public choice is all they're saying is let's be as cynical with government officials as we are with people who run private sector corporations. And then the rest kind of follows naturally because there's less constraints on, or I should say fewer constraints on government officials.
So we know names like Tulloch in public choice. We know names like Buchanan in public choice, whom Nancy McLean famously attacked after the poor guy was dead. Who are the big public choice names today who might be writing about this? Would you consider Tyler Cowen a public choice school member today? I mean, I can't really think off the top of my head who I would pigeonhole as public choice today, or the top public choice economist.
So I'm not sure like who would, if somebody would say like, oh, what am I? I am public choice, like, card carrying. This is who I am, and that's how I identify. Would they have that as their pronouns on Twitter? I'm not sure, but certainly the George Mason school. If you go to get a PhD in economics at George Mason, yes, you're not just learning. You do learn Austrian stuff, but they also really stress the public choice school. So yeah, anybody coming out of the GMU pipeline is well acquainted with that.
Well, it's interesting. I wonder if this is a bit of a hindrance for the Austrian school. If you look at, for example, the way Man, Economy, and State by Rothbard, the way Human Action by Mises are laid out as books, they sort of start with this idea of acting man, and then they get into catalactics and they talk about man acting in an economy and barter and exchange and trade, and then they get into money. And then later on, they come in with interventionism or even full socialism. And that's, Mises has a whole section called the hampered market economy before he gets into full socialism. So, it's almost like government or central banks are these overlays that come along later, where most economic schools have thought they just view government as a given, and it's kind of woven into the analysis from point A, right? I mean, throughout, it's like, well, yeah, of course we're going to have these bureaucracies, so how can we make them good? Whereas the Austrian mindset is to view that as this outside agent, almost like a cancer that comes in. And so, maybe we're not as adept at disabusing people of the wisdom of this approach because we're, again, always falling back to well, that's not real laissez-faire. That you've got a central bank.
Right. So I think the logical approach that like Rothbard does, where he first analyzes, action per se of the isolated individual, then with more people, and let's first assume it's voluntary, and then we later relax that assumption and blah, blah, blah. I think that does make sense. But however, I would say I do think some Austrians, because there's, no, I only believe in Austrian economics. That's all I'm going to read. I don't need to, concern myself with the work of Niskanen or whoever. I do think there are some insights that they do miss out on. So now, in fairness, the stuff that the public choice school focuses on, is it like praxeology per se? Maybe not. But there, like I said, there are certain results, like things about appealing to the median voter, and there's things that maybe some would just say, well, that's so obvious, we didn't need some PhD to point it out to us. But things like, why is it that the politicians are more radical, during the primaries, and then they moderate, things like that. But I mean, that's just one example. But to show, that they do model things, and so there are, I guess, that there's results in the public choice school that I think Austrians who've never looked at that, they could benefit from reading it, but it's not that you would need to throw out your Austrian framework. It's just, oh yeah, so we're going to make specific assumptions about how people, what they value or what they're going after, what their goals are. Then, this school offers some ways of analyzing the situation that maybe I hadn't thought of before.
Well, let's finish on this. Let's talk about the rule of law, which Merrick Garland has brought up of late, and which people like David French at National Review are clinging to. Now, we could link to any number of articles on Mises.org that would say, oh, this has always been a fantasy and rule of law has never really existed, and there's always been all these malevolent actors and special deals for state-connected cronies and yada, yada. But that doesn't change the fact that, America is wealthier and better than many parts of the world because we have had reasonably robust and predictable property rights, reasonably robust and predictable dispute litigation procedures in our state, local, federal courts. I mean, we have had more rule of law than, let's say, Venezuela in the past 25 years. So it's not just a complete chimera. I mean, are we in a dangerous period now where everybody views, let's say, the Trump thing, regardless of which side you're on, everyone views it so cynically that we risk, not understanding what's happening in America, and that, when we talk glibly about, well, we're going to have a civil war, we're going to have a national divorce. I certainly am an advocate of the latter, not the former. Are we naive in the sense that we've actually had it pretty good because we've enjoyed, somewhat of a robust rule of law as opposed to a banana republic?
So, yeah, I think you're right on that, Jeff, that certainly if Americans, American libertarian types that really haven't been abroad too much, if they just dismiss it, oh yeah, this is all a joke. It's the monopoly state can do whatever they want, and they're just a criminal organization. Period. I think that is wrong because it's what you're overlooking, and and Rothbard and stuff gets into this, so it's not that you could think that their moral justification is nothing more than a criminal organization, but what sets the state apart from a mere gang is that in the eyes of the public, they do have some form of legitimacy. And it's true, as you say, Jeff, like that legitimacy is shrinking by the day, depending on, which party's in power. And then, a different 40% of the public now doesn't think they're legitimate. So that is shrinking. But I mean, that's what distinguishes it. And in terms of, Mises wrote a lot about the importance of public opinion. He had statements saying in the long run, there can be no such thing as an unpopular government. And at first that sounds like, what are you talking about, Mises? That's crazy. But when you see what he means by that, and again, for people that have never thought that way, why even the most totalitarian dictators, they have a tight control over the news, over, the internet now in the modern age, over the schools. So if it was just all a matter of who has the most tanks and guns, you wouldn't care what your people thought. But no, it's in precisely the most closed societies where they really control the flow of information, because the dictator, above all people, knows how tenuous his power really is. That there's millions of people, there's only a few thousand of his inner circle, or even the inner circle could just turn on him and kill him in his sleep if they thought he was taking the country in a bad direction. So, that's public opinion really is important and shaping those ideas, and that's why the intellectual elite holding up the government is really very important in the long run. Why ideas are so important in the long run. So yeah, as far as rule of law though, Jeff, I think you're right that some like American Rothbardian type, especially younger people, they might be a little bit too quick to dismiss everything as, it's all a bunch of garbage if they haven't been abroad. But it is also the case that, what we do have here is, I think, eroding fast. Just a quick example, like in terms of journalism, that CNN was always biased, but before Trump came along, they at least pretended that they were being objective. You know what I mean? Like, in other words, after Trump really marked a turning point in my mind of just how divided the news cycle, so that now it really is the case that Fox is talking to one part and CNN's talking to a different part, or MSNBC, whatever you want to say. And, it's even the basic facts are getting, it's not just that we're all agreeing on what happened on January 6th and we're disagreeing about the interpretation or the significance. It's that, no, one side is saying it was an insurrection, and the other side saying, it was a riot, or it was a crowd kind of went run amok, or what have you. Like, it's really what people are thinking of is what happened. Or Trump praised Nazis in the one speech, and the other side saying, no, he was actually disavowing them. What are you talking about? Like, it's people can't even agree on what the basic facts of history are.
Well, it's going to be interesting to see what happens, or let's say the next week, when we find out more about maybe the specifics of this warrant. Maybe the Trump lawyers will reveal it at some point, but it's also going to be interesting to watch whether this emboldens Trump and Trump supporters to run again, or whether this is sort of the beginning of the end for him in terms of his electoral hopes for 2024. And in the meantime, We will link to Mises's Bureaucracy, which is a fascinating book. You can read it in a very short period just over this weekend for free online at Mises.org. We'll link to that really interesting article by Jonathan Turley that talks through some of the legal angles of the 14th Amendment and federal statutes on what might disqualify Trump. And in the interim, we'll just hope that none of you get raided by the FBI or audited by the IRS. And so Bob and everybody else, have a great weekend.
Check back next week for a new episode of the Human Action Podcast. And in the meantime, you can find more content like this at Mises.org.